Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 296. This week we're trying to fit in questions from guides 372 and 373, that's to the interwar, Emden, and SMS Seeadler, along with the Wednesday videos on Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku and the English Armada of 1589, plus Friday videos on the Roman legions and academia versus social media. So, better get on with questions then. Nolan Anderson asks, it feels to me like the turrets of a ship take up relatively little amount of their weight. Obviously there has to be magazines, etc., but does this take up a huge amount of space? Could you build a ship just bristling with guns, say 3 turrets forward and 2 aft, each turret containing 3 or 4 guns each? And does the size of each gun change the facilities needed to operate that gun much? The size of gun definitely does affect things. Broadly speaking, you can divide up battleship, cruiser, channel time period, dreadnought, pre-dreadnought era guns into 3 categories when it comes to the operation of the gun. I would personally, although it's not an official term, I would term these hand-loaded, partially hand-loaded or human-assisted loaded, and power-operated with human supervision. So the first one, hand-loaded, is fairly simple. That's a gun where either the entire round, so the shell and the charge all as one thing, can just be carried around by a human relatively easily, put into the breech, off it goes. Or in some of the large guns, perhaps the shell can be handled, and then you have to also manually feed the charge. The charge obviously is going to be lighter than the shell itself. Then you get to the, partially hand-loaded or perhaps machine-assisted human-operated loading. It's a little bit of a clumsy term, but it is a bit of a clumsy middle ground. And that's where now the shell, because the charge, as I said, at any time, usually the charge is manhandleable, except at the really absurd scales. But the shell has now gotten too heavy, realistically, for people to handle either at all or in continuous rapid fire. And so the shell hoist will dump the shell either directly into a tray where it can then be rammed into the gun, or it will be elevated and dumped into a loading tray next to the gun from which the shell can be tipped or rolled into the gun. And the reason I say it's partially human operated is that quite often, although the shell is too heavy for people to pick up and carry, again, either at all or in a rapid manner, once the shell and or charge gets into the gun itself or into the loading tray directly behind the breech, there may be some facility for people to essentially hand load, finish the loading process. So the shell may be too heavy for you to pick up and carry 20 feet, but if the shell is lying there in the loading tray, it may be that you can use some kind of loading mechanism or even just a stick to feed it into the 5-inch gun or the 6-inch gun or the something of that rough caliber. And obviously you'd ideally want a rammer, but you can get away without it, so hence that kind of intermediate section. And then you get up to battleship guns, some heavy cruiser guns as well. And at that point, if you need hydraulic rammers or electric rammers, but you need some kind of power-assisted ramming because no point of the loading process is really manhandleable once the shell gets up into the turret. Now, obviously, people may be carrying individual charge portions out in the magazines and so forth, but once the stuff gets up to the gun turret, if you've got a shell that weighs over 1,000 pounds, possibly over 2,000 pounds or even 3,000 pounds in the case of Yamato's, no reasonable number of men in a turret pushing a stick are going to be able to shove that thing into the breech of the gun, possibly at all, certainly even at the lower ends, at least if the gun is elevated in any significant manner. So you absolutely need a hydraulic or electric rammer at that point. And the charges, although individually may be manhandleable and possibly movable, once they've stacked up enough to propel said massive shell, then they are far too heavy for it to be reasonable to be loaded. So, 110-pound charge on an Iowa class, yes, fine, you can manhandle that, but you possibly could also hand load that if you were careful. But 660 pounds for all the full stack, that's not happening. So at that scale, yes, you need essentially power loading. It's just that humans may supervise when something gets lifted or shove something across or something like that, but all the major elements of moving the shell around in the loading process in the turret are handled by machinery. Now, as for the turrets taking up relatively little of the ship's weight, it depends on a couple of things. They do take up a very large amount of space. I mean, this is a Tillman 4.2, so this is your kind of, 5-turret ship with 4, 5, or 6 guns per turret. And you can see from the columns of the barbettes going deep into the ship, and then obviously the armor to protect them, how much weight you attribute to the turrets depends a lot on how much you want to protect the turrets and where you consider the turret as a whole to end. Turrets take up a huge amount of deck space, and therefore also volume. But then, of course, the turret has to sit on the barbette, unless you really like exploding. And the barbette also takes up a lot of weight and a huge amount of volume. And then that goes down to the magazines and shell rooms and the handling rooms, and they take up a huge amount of space and volume. In fact, on a battleship or something like that, you'll tend to find that although the machinery rooms may be larger in overall dimensions, the single largest open space on a large capital ship will actually be where the shells and the charges are loaded at the bottom end of the hoists and taken up to the turrets. So if you include the weight of the hoists, the weight of the barbette, and the rotational mechanisms and the guns and the turret and all the mechanisms in the turret, that actually does add up to quite a lot of weight. And of course, the weight of the turret and the guns proportionally affects the ship significantly more than the weight of the ship's armor, because they're much higher up. But of course, you could go with 1-inch thick turret plating, which is essentially at that point only splinter-proof, and maybe if that, and that would save you a lot of weight on the turrets if you wanted to have lots of them. The Japanese heavy cruisers, for example, went down that route. But then, of course, you're taking the risk of trading off having lots of guns versus the potential of having a very explosive end very quickly if any of those turrets get hit. Captain Zilla asks, why did Germany scuttle so many of their ships at the end of the war? And from the context, this being in the Emden video, I presume they're talking about the Second World War. For mostly similar reasons to why the Germans scuttled their fleet in Scapa Flow at the end of World War I. There's a certain culture in some militaries, and even within certain services within certain militaries, of, death before dishonor. And it was held quite often that it was preferable, certainly for something inanimate like a ship, to rather be sunk, therefore technically destroyed, than fall into enemy hands. So when it was very clear that Germany was losing the war, and areas were having to be evacuated, and you had a choice of, well, we can evacuate this area on foot, but we have to leave the ship behind, or we deny this ship, we deny that this ship is going to be of use to the enemy by scuttling it first, they would go with scuttling it. And that's not really a hugely German-only thing. I mean, look at World War II in general, or even, these days and everywhere in between and before. If you look at perhaps a smaller scale, if a pilot, let's say in World War II, was forced to crash land their aircraft, they were highly encouraged, and in some cases, depending on the service, mandated to do their level best to destroy the aircraft, open the fuel tanks, use a flare pistol to set fire to it, to deny that both the aircraft itself and intelligence from that aircraft to the enemy. And tanks and so forth, if your tank was knocked out, you were supposed to, if you were obviously evacuating it, you were supposed to, again, sabotage it, set it on fire, set off something, hopefully delayed that would cause it to explode, again, to deny its use to the enemy. And when that didn't happen, then your enemy gets hold of some of your most recent military technology, and everything gets very awkward. I mean, that's the reason why the Tank Museum has Tiger 131, because according to standing regulations, when that Tiger was abandoned, it should have been torched at the very least, but it wasn't, so they got a near enough intact Tiger. Well, the British Army did, and the Tank Museum eventually ended up with it. And scuttling your ship to deny it to the enemy is just an extension of that. Emma Bird asks, which Lutzow, or is it Lutzow or Lutzow, German speakers in the comments below, had a hard time at the hands of Norwegian shore batteries when Blücher was sunk? That would be the Deutschland class, the pocket battleship, in quotation marks, or Panzerschiff Lutzow ex-Deutschland, the one pictured here with the 6-11-inch guns. And yeah, she had some spectacularly bad luck, or potentially spectacularly good luck if you are looking at it from the perspective of a Norwegian shore battery commander, and either subject to one of the single unluckiest shots on the planet, or excellent gunnery, again, depending on which perspective you're looking at. In as much as, obviously, you just got the two main battery turrets, one fore, one aft, and when you're going up the fjord, you can only aim the forward battery turret, because if you turn to present the other one, you're going to run into one side or the other in pretty short order, which is not really conducive to your overall health. And with Blücher taking an absolute beating up ahead, that meant that the still fairly formidable 3 11-inch guns on the forward part of Lutzow could really cause major problems for the Norwegian shore batteries, except that, as far as the accounts go, one of the Norwegian shore batteries managed to send a shell directly into the turret. And you might think, well, hang on, the turret has faceplate armor exactly to prevent this. And yes, you are correct. However, as some questions in the Drydock have asked before, well, is the opening in the turret where the gun elevates up and down, is this a vulnerability? And statistically speaking, the answer is no, because the odds of actually hitting that are incredibly slim. And there's not really a huge amount you can do about it, because you need the space to elevate the guns, unless you include some extremely heavily armoured casement shield or something. But in this particular case, those 1 in a million or 1 in a billion odds came into play. The shell flew right in, again, as far as I can tell from the sources, right above one of the guns. So obviously we're looking at the aft turret here, but you can see that little gap. And upon detonation inside the turret, it managed to sever the hydraulic lines, which actually allowed or gave the pressure that allowed you to elevate and depress the guns. So with no pressure, and apparently the system was all tied into one set of hydraulic lines, so if you lost pressure from this set of severed lines, none of the guns could work. So all the guns went from suddenly being able to aim to all just drooping rather sadly and flaccidly in front of the front of the ship, and no use to anybody, which meant that aside from a couple of the secondary guns down the side, Lutzow was essentially completely disarmed from the perspective of facing off against the Norwegian shore batteries, hence why she turned around and skedaddled. They were able to patch her up and repair her and come back a little bit later on, but it remains probably one of the most spectacularly unlikely hits in naval history, given the sheer tiny size of that target point and its effects, especially considering Lutzow was not stationary at the time. Put it this way, it's even more unlikely than the shot that hit Hood. Palodian asks, concerning the capture of the future SMS Seeadler, why was one submarine crewman enough to convince the crew to sail for Germany, British prize crew excluded because they'd been locked up, when they could have easily overpowered him after the U-boat left? Also, what was the British reaction if and when they learned of the incident? I can't imagine they'd have been very pleased to learn an American crew bought their freedom by surrendering British citizens directly to their enemies. Were there any repercussions for the American crew when they got back home, if documented at all? I'm not aware of any direct consequences for the American crew in the aftermath, although it's not a fine detail of the story that I've looked into with any great detail, so maybe somebody else knows. But I would suspect that they probably didn't face much of any, at least initial, repercussions. Perhaps once America joined the war against Germany, people might have been giving them a bit of a side eye. But nonetheless, the reason that the single submarine crewman was enough to convince them to sail for Germany was because at the time, remember, America was a neutral country. So they weren't under, at least to their minds, any particular obligation to acquiesce to the wishes of one side or the other. The whole neutral rights versus blockade in time of war is a persistent issue that America has had with European countries at war that goes all the way back to the Napoleonic Wars. But without getting into that legalistic side of things, you have two elements to it. You have the purely legalistic, which is that once a ship has been taken by a prize crew, if you then overpower said prize crew and retake the ship and go off on your own way, the rules of war, such as they are at the time, obviously require somebody to stop a ship, put aboard a prize crew if they want to take it, or at least inspect it, let the crew off and then sink it. The crews are warfare rules. But if in the aftermath the merchant vessel decides, actually, we're not going to cooperate, and enacts harm on the prize crew and goes off on their merry way, they have, for the most part, then lost most of the protections that they would have otherwise under said rules of war, because the rules are, and the way they're written, especially at the time, they only apply if everybody cooperates with them. If you're in violation of them, then obviously you get in trouble. But if somebody violates them first and you retaliate, then essentially there's not really a whole lot of repercussions for you. So if the crew just rose up and let's say they threw the British crew overboard, then any subsequent British ship that came across them could very well and justifiably blow them clean out of the water, because it's clear they can't be trusted. Now, locking them up is a different matter, locking the British prize crew up, because you're not actually putting them, you're not harming them. And the argument in that particular case would be that their presence aboard the ship had endangered the ship, because there's a German U-boat right there. So if the German U-boat understands that the ship is under British control, then they could either sink the ship after letting the crew off under normal cruiser warfare rules, or given that it's World War I U-boats, they might just decide to sink it outright, both of which risks, obviously, massive financial loss for the ship and its owners, and also risks the safety of everybody aboard, at which point the ship's master or captain can make an argument that by locking those prize crew up, he's actually saving them, his cargo, his ship, and his own crew from danger. But once there's a new prize crew aboard, even if it is only one person, he is then obligated under pretty much the same rules as previously to follow that person's instruction, because now they are in charge. And if he did anything to that U-boat crewman, then any other German ship that came across them could very well sink them outright. And, well, if it turns out that you'd actually overpowered and gotten rid of two separate prize crews from both sides of the war, then essentially at that point your ship is just going to be sunk on sight by everybody, which is not necessarily a good situation to put yourself in. So that's the legalistic side of things, at least as far as the rules of war were concerned in World War I, as far as I understand them. There's also the personal side of things, which was that, the captain wasn't particularly happy with the British taking his ship over in the first place. And so, just if anything else, out of a fit of pique, if the other side shows up and says, well, actually, we're going to take over your ship. Well, if your ship's going to be taken over one way or the other, you might, out of spite, just decide, well, we'd prefer to be taken over by the other side from the one who came and arbitrarily and unfairly took over my ship. Josh Thomas Moore asks, Titanic was doomed because of overflowing from one compartment to the next, but how did this happen? I understand that the compartments would overflow once the bow was below the water, but how did it happen beforehand? Well, there were two primary factors. Firstly, there was the fact that the watertight compartmentalization with the bulkheads only extended part way up the ship. Now, obviously, given that the channel mostly discusses warships, that might sound slightly odd to you, but you've got to remember, especially if you've been on a museum ship and you've seen them, that the watertight bulkheads and their doors, with all the dogging latches and etc., are pretty substantial things. And if you are a passenger liner and you want grand uninterrupted stairways and hallways for that matter, rather than hallways where passengers are having to stop every 20, 30 feet to step over the lip of an e-knocker and, swing open and shut this massive heavy steel door, then at some point higher up in the ship, you're going to go, okay, no, we're not going to take these any further up because, well, we're well above the waterline. And so, if the water floods, it shouldn't get above the waterline in theory, which was the design idea behind Titanic. So you can see her here, but the bow bulkheads, which were the ones that went up the highest, were still a full deck level, a full deck level from the continuous deck below the upper deck of Titanic. So in this case, you can see you've got the little white forecastle there, and then you've got another full deck below that, and then only then below that full deck do you have the watertight bulkheads, and that once you get further back, so if you get to the dip between the forecastle and the main superstructure, you now have to go down 2 decks before you find the top of the bulkheads. And what that meant was that obviously above that there weren't continuous longitudinal bulkheads with watertight doors, and so when you had one more compartment than the ship was designed to withstand flooding the ship, and therefore the ship begins to go significantly down by the bow, it doesn't have to have the bow go completely under the water, it just has to have the bow go down far enough, in this case, if you're looking at this photo, probably half to 2/3 of the way down, before the water has risen to a level inside where it can overtop the bulkheads and flow into the next compartment, and then it obviously weighs the ship down more and into the next compartment, and so on and so forth. So that's one issue. The other issue is the fact that, as it turns out, the ship was not quite as watertight between those compartments as theoretically it should have been. So there were reports of water bubbling up through the floor plates in an otherwise unbreached compartment, so water was going presumably through the ship's double bottom and coming up that way via pressure. And as I've mentioned before, the ship had longitudinal rather than fore to aft coal bunkers, and whilst the coal bunker doors were not strictly supposed to be watertight pressure doors, the fact that they were laid out laterally, i.e. across the ship rather than fore to aft, didn't help either. It contributed to the flooding happening faster, and it allowed for water to then build up and flow through into the machinery spaces, which accelerated the ship sinking. One of my little personal theories is if the ship had been built more conventionally with coal bunkers running fore to aft on either side of the ship, it probably still would have sunk, but it might have stayed afloat long enough for Carpathia to arrive before she went down. And before anyone starts, no, a ship not being quite as watertight as it should be with regards to its bulkheads is not an unusual feature of the Titanic. It happens in quite a few different ship sinkings. It's not ideal and it shouldn't happen, but when you're talking about something this complex, especially by the time you get to the 20th century, where you've got plumbing and electrics and all sorts of other things having to pierce bulkheads, statistically speaking, the bulkheads are perhaps best designed as significantly water retaining rather than necessarily watertight. You could perhaps criticize Titanic for not being fully watertight at her bulkheads, despite being a fairly new ship. That would be a valid criticism, but the fact that water got through at all it's a lot more common than you'd think. Just look at how Nevada ended up at the bottom at Pearl Harbor. Someone with a name I can't actually decipher asks, how can you distinguish ships of different countries in the age of sail except for the flags? For example, how could I tell the difference between a Dutch ship of the line and a British ship of the line? It depends hugely on the time period and also on the distance, because if you're up close, then you can almost certainly recognize specific design features and design styles, like the shape of the ship's stern or the way the ship's beak, prow, bowsprit, figurehead, etc., whatever you want to call it, is presented. If it gets close enough, you can count the number of gun ports. That's less reliable because, for example, in the classic Age of Sail, a lot of people have 74s, but statistically speaking, if you cite an 80 gunner, that's usually more likely to be a French or Spanish ship, because the only 80 gunners, for the most part in British service, are captured ones for third rates. Conversely, if you see a 98 gunner, that's British, because nobody else runs second rates in the classic Age of Sail. And towards the latter part of the classic Age of Sail, and the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, people start to adopt national-specific paint schemes. Now, this is one of the things I've mentioned a few times on the Drydock, in that we don't know for certain, despite it being an extremely heavily chronicled and looked into battle, we don't actually know what exactly the vast majority of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar looked like. We have some ideas, and we have some specific ships. So 2 Spanish ships were noted to have black hulls. We pretty sure Santissima Trinidad had black with red stripes, and we know obviously that the British rule in the Nelson Checker. But as far as everybody else is concerned, it's all a little bit wishy-washy, because there was no standardized hull pattern and paint scheme for French and Spanish ships until the very last years of the Napoleonic Wars. But in the majority of the 1810s and then the 1820s, 30s, etc., you could tell everybody, because everybody had their own little paint scheme. But for a period in the early part of the 19th century, if you saw a ship with white sails, that was American, because America, shockingly, grew a lot of cotton, and they discovered in that time period that you could make sails of cotton, and this was actually a lot better for most uses than the canvas cloth which everybody else used for sails. And of course, one of the things with cotton sheets is that they're nice and brilliant white. So if you saw an ship with brilliant white cotton sails, it was going to be an American ship, until everybody else adopted that idea. And then everybody had white sails, which kind of mitigated against that. Going back to the other end of the Age of Sail, at the early period, sometimes a ship would be so unique for one reason or another, whether it had a very particular profile or it was just so massive, that you had no choice but to identify it as a very specific vessel belonging to a specific side. So, for example, in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, the Dutch didn't have anything approaching Sovereign of the Seas, so if you saw this socking great 3-decker and, occasionally, especially early on, with all the shiny, glittery gold, well, there's not really much way of misidentifying that as anything but Sovereign of the Seas, and therefore British. There were some other vaguely nationally identifying characteristics. So French and Spanish ships, at least in the Napoleonic era Age of Sail, tended to be a little bit longer than their British counterparts. So if you saw a longer, sleeker vessel, it may well be Franco-Spanish, could also be captured in British service. If you were in the Channel in the Anglo-Dutch Wars or thereafter, and you saw a ship of the line standing in what you knew to be fairly shallow water, where it probably shouldn't be, and it wasn't showing signs of distress, then it was probably Dutch, because they tended to run shallower drafts than everybody else. But these tend to be very situational and specific. In the broadest terms, without the flags hoisted, it was actually very difficult to tell at a distance what ships belonged to who. And when you look at, for example, the War of 1812 series, a couple of times you'll note that there was kind of a feeling out phase where the two ships got closer and closer and closer to each other, and they were still trying to work out, is this ship on our side? Is it on the enemy side? Who are they actually serving under? And it's only either when they got close enough to recognize some very specific characteristics, or one side or the other decided to hoist their flag, that they were actually able to go, ah, right, action time. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, did the Royal Navy ever consider creating a naval version of the 17-pounder, or the quick-firing 3.7-inch gun that the British Army was using? You previously mentioned the Royal Navy was really hurting for dual-purpose guns in this approximate calibre, and the British Army was putting a 17-pounder on just about anything that could fit one, and some things that couldn't quite, even though, to my knowledge, the UK didn't try and turn the 17-pounder skywards. It should, in theory, be more than capable for anti-aircraft duties. As far as I'm aware, there wasn't any proposal to do so, probably on two grounds. Firstly, as I mentioned in previous Drydock, converting a land gun to a navy gun is a considerably more difficult process because of the saltwater environment than the reverse. But also, if you wanted a dual-purpose gun in approximately that calibre, the Royal Navy already had, well, several different versions of the 4-inch gun, which is, within a rounding error of that calibre. And as far as dual-purpose armament was concerned, whilst the 4-inch was produced in fairly large quantities, the Royal Navy really wanted a heavier gun for the dual-purpose role. Now, of course, they tried the 4.7 and the 5.25. Neither of them worked out particularly well, and they eventually settled on the 4.5. But even the 4.5 is a considerably larger gun than the 3.7. So when you look at the 3.7, although it's a fairly useful gun on land, it doesn't have the stopping power for anti-surface actions. It's actually a little bit small even for a heavy anti-aircraft gun, at least as far as the British are concerned, and it's just a little bit too big when you get to the latter stages of the war for the development of auto-loading, when you get things like the auto-loading 3-inch. Brendan Buersdorf asks, given the magnitude of the situation, why didn't the Spanish have any ships harass the English Armada as it moved around? It seems a bit odd that with this massive English fleet, the Spanish Navy didn't try to do anything at all aside from send a couple of galleys after them in the end. There's a mixture of factors. Firstly, in the aftermath of the Spanish Armada, the Spanish battle fleet, such as it was incredibly stretched, because obviously they sent a huge number of ships, a good portion of their combat power, to England. That hadn't worked out, and a good chunk of them didn't come back, and of the ones that did, the vast majority were quite badly damaged and or semi-depopulated in terms of crew, like some of the ships that the English Armada actually ran into in their first port of call when they attacked. Most of them were further east, the ones that shall we say, slightly less patriotically motivated portion of the English Armada decided not to go after when Drake really wanted to, but they were still damaged and refitting. And the Spanish also had other concerns because they have the Mediterranean, which they don't have sole proprietorship of, but the Ottoman Empire is still a fairly significant threat. So there's Spanish warships over there. They're not really able to quickly relocate because otherwise they'll expose Spain's interest in that area. You also have treasure ships and the treasure fleet and the ships that are guarding that or being part of that or guarding generally the Central and South American coastlines and seas. They're obviously stuck on the other side of the ocean. They're not going to make it back in time. And again, you would sacrifice Spanish security in those areas. And that actually leaves you with remarkably few ships available on the Spanish coastline capable of sailing out and actually challenging the English ships. That isn't to say that they didn't. The few ships that were available did go out, and especially when the English fleet was a bit scattered, they did pick off ships here and there and undertake general harassment duties. But the simple fact was that if they had tried to coordinate any substantial, squadron or flotilla level response of, double-digit numbers of ships, the English had far, far more ships. So if you put them all in one place, then, or even have a squadron following, the chances of the English just turning around and utterly swamping them and capturing them is pretty high. Whereas if it's a handful of galleys here, which obviously can also exploit rowing against the wind or rowing in periods of no wind, and a handful of ships, they're little snappy attacks, then especially when the English fleet is dispersed, it's much more difficult for the English to respond to them. And because you're only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ships, if an overwhelming response looks like it's coalescing, it's relatively easy for you to go, actually, you know what, we're out of here, rather than trying to undertake full squadron or flotilla manoeuvres. Jeff by B asks a pretty long question, but I'll pick out some of the highlight bits towards the end. He's basically talking about thicknesses of wood and armour in American Civil War era ships and before. But if the 24-pounders of Vasa-era cannon could penetrate up to 36 inches of wood, why were so many casemates, including the timber clads and tin clads of the American Civil War that maybe had an inch of boilerplate built on top of them, have 24-inch wooden walls behind? There were also Spanish ships built to attack Gibraltar that had, I think, 4-foot thick walls that were registered as shot-proof but not fireproof, and Fulton's War of 1812 New York City defense ship that I think had maybe 4 or 6 foot thick wooden walls. Essentially, it comes down to a mixture of factors. You've got range, you've got cannon type, to a certain degree angle of impact, but also other materials. So if you shot at an arbitrary thickness of timber, whether that's 2, 3, 4, 5 feet, whatever, if you shot it with a 24-pounder bronze gun like on Vasa from close range, like you were having an up-close and personal melee combat, then yeah, it's probably going to go through and cause massive amounts of splinters, which isn't good for anybody inside. But if you're fighting at longer distances, 500,000 yards or so, then as the shot loses a lot of energy as it passes through the air and hits you with less force, then at that point, that wooden armour, if you like, might resist the shot, either bounce it or just absorb it and you just get it stuck in your side. Plus, of course, you have the fact that a 24-pounder is still a relatively powerful gun. Now, it's a typical armament for a small ship of the line, very latterly a very heavy frigate, or the secondary battery on a really big ship of the line, and latterly the secondary battery for third rates. However, the ships of the line, and later on the big heavy frigates, are much rarer compared to 9, 12 and 18-pounder armed frigates. And also frigates will tend to be ships that will come in and attack in close, shallow waters because they're more capable for that kind of role, at which point the lesser energies of those guns may be resisted by particularly thick or particularly tough or both wooden planking. So even if it doesn't obviate all the guns you might be facing, if it can obviate a large number of them, then that's a good thing. And then, of course, you've also got, as you said, with things like the tin clads, even an inch of iron plating, even if that's not enough to resist cannon shot of the time at anything like a reasonable range, it will significantly reduce the energy of said round, which means, again, if you're facing off against an 18 or a 24-pounder, then if you've got 2 foot thick wood and with an inch of iron over it, the 2 foot of wood might not resist such a shot, but the iron in the process of it being broken might take out enough energy from the shot that the remaining energy is not sufficient to penetrate the wood. And in that case, obviously, then the wood would also absorb any iron splinters, which would be quite useful. So it's partially the circumstances of exactly what kind of cannon is being shot at you and what range and what you're hoping to achieve, but also just because it can't resist 100% of cannon doesn't make armour that can resist, say, 80 or 90% of cannon that are being shot of you entirely without merit, much in the same way as, a modern bulletproof vest isn't going to stop a Barrett 50 cal, but people still wear them because the chances of being shot with one of those as compared to being shot by 5.56 or maybe 7.62, well, there's a lot more of the latter flying around than the big stuff. HyperPie asks, how do you distinguish between a good, accurate book or account of an event and a bad or lying one? There's a variety of ways. Not all of them work with all books, but it's probably worth mentioning in brief some of the more general techniques I use. Firstly, consider the author. Is the author one with a pretty good reputation for accuracy, or are they completely new to the field? Now, that doesn't mean a new to the field author is necessarily going to be wrong or inaccurate. Everyone's got to start somewhere at some point. But for example, if I was to pull a book that has John Jordan or Norman Friedman or any number of other people, Winfield, for example, off of the shelf, those people have a very extensive portfolio of peer-reviewed and well-regarded books. So the statistical odds of them producing a really bad one are relatively low. Obviously, it's not 100% out of the question, but it puts you on a good footing. The next thing to do is to check what kind of work you're looking at. If you're looking at a work that is purporting to be a deep reference work about, extensive history, technical details, 2, 3, 4, 500 page doorstopper of a book, it should have an extensive bibliography. How extensive is that bibliography? What sources does it cite? Is it citing primarily secondary sources, i.e. other books? If it is citing them, then apply the previous measure. How good are the authors of the books it's citing, and what percentage of primary research material is it citing, and how extensively is it citing it? Is it kind of ADM 133-271-B-4 and that's it, or is it, here is a quote in quotation marks, a block of text that is from said ADM number? Or even is it a statement footnoted to an ADM number and then a footnote in the back or underneath that goes into a lot more detail about what that ADM specifically says and why they've summarized it in the way they have? Obviously, that gives you more confidence in what's being said. Then you've got the range of sources. Obviously, a book that's, say, about French battleships is obviously going to cite predominantly, hopefully, French sources. That's not a bad thing. But if you're, say, doing a book about Jutland, if the book cites almost exclusively British sources, then the chances of it fairly representing everything that was happening on the German side as well are somewhat diminished. And vice versa, if a book cites almost exclusively German sources, the chances of reflecting what the British were doing accurately is somewhat diminished. Unless, of course, it specifically says that that's what it's trying to achieve, not inaccurately portray things. But, for example, if using another example, when there's a rather good book about the Spanish experience at the Battle of Trafalgar. Now, of course, that's going to cite primarily Spanish sources because it's trying to tell the story of the Spanish experience of Trafalgar. The fact that it doesn't cite a huge number of French or British sources is not a mark against it in that particular situation. So you have to consider the type of book you're reading. To a certain extent, you can also look at what do other books about that time period or that specific instance or that specific ship say. Because if there are other decent books out there, and this book broadly agrees with them, then the chances of it being pretty good are fairly good. This one is a little bit more of a fraught one, though, because there are some instances, battleships, etc., which are very controversial, or there's patchy evidence or research material available for, and so the fact that a particular book may disagree quite significantly with other books that have come before it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad one. It could mean that they've uncovered something particularly new and interesting. And, further to that, it may be that, actually everyone else was wrong before. And the new book presents things from a completely different perspective with brand new evidence. And that's when you go back and look at, who's the author, what are the sources they cite, etc., etc. So, for example, if you were to look at Shattered Sword purely through the perspective of what are other well-regarded books saying about Midway at the time, you might conclude it was a bad book because it talks about, the Japanese not having packed flight decks of aircraft. But in actual fact, when you go into it in more detail, you realise that from the range of sources and the number of sources that it's citing, that actually it's a good book, and the previous claims were wrong because they were citing from one or two very specific sources in exclusion that had been translated into English. You can also look out for things like contradictory claims. If a book claims one thing on one page but then turns around and says something that's almost directly the opposite 2 pages later, that's probably an indication of a not particularly well thought out or researched book. And you can also look for tone or language when you start to see, literary flourishes and techniques and identify, that this person is using a specific literary technique to try and make a point that isn't necessarily strictly supported by the direct evidence presented, or the writing has a particularly overt tone one way or the other, either particularly in favour of one side or ship or person, or particularly against another side or ship or person, that will start to call into question the reliability of the book, unless they can present a lot of evidence justifying why they are taking such a pejorative view or superlative view of a particular thing that they're writing about. And generally, again, this is a very broad point, but generally speaking, somebody who takes a particularly pejorative or superlative view of a very specific thing, like a specific person, a specific ship, a specific campaign, is probably on safer grounds than somebody who is very dismissive of, something overall, because generalizations tend usually to be quite wrong. Unless, of course, again, they can back it up with rather specific evidence. And then perhaps on a meta level, to wrap this bit up, looking at a wider social and temporal, potentially even political context, when has this book come out, and are there larger circumstances that might influence the content or reflect an agenda that the author might have? Now, sometimes books might be released around a certain specific time period or anniversary because, well, that's when people are going to be interested in them, so that, there makes sense for a book to be released at that point. So at the time that this video is released, in a couple of months, we're coming up to the 80th anniversary, 80th, of the D-Day landings. So brace yourselves, if you haven't noticed already, there's going to be a whole slew of books about the D-Day landings and various aspects of them released. And some of them, particularly there's one coming up about Sword Beach, or I think maybe has been released about Sword Beach, which is really good. But there's also going to be a whole lot of dreck that's going to come out, cheap, quickly smashed out stuff that is horrifically inaccurate. And without pointing any specific fingers, I would also generally say that anybody who's trying to publish a book that's telling you exactly why something's happened and both sides of the war and exactly what's going on in this war or conflict or whatever, whilst said conflict is actually going on, unless they are publishing their personal experiences, like I was there for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, whatever, other than that, they're probably talking a load of trash and nonsense, because frankly speaking, while the war is actually going on, such things like classification and stuff mean you cannot possibly know everything about what's going on. And if you think you do, well, either you're working for some, Illuminati-level intelligence agency, in which case you shouldn't be saying anything, or you're deluded. Primark359 asks, were there any attempts at a jet torpedo bomber, or was the torpedo on its way out by the time a powerful enough jet engine would have been available? I mean, technically speaking, yes, there were plenty, if you count all the various maritime patrol aircraft, whether they be carrier-launched or land-launched, in the Cold War that could carry anti-submarine torpedoes, like an S-3 Viking or something. But that's really being a little bit cheaty when it comes to the definition of torpedo bomber. Yes, they are a bomber-type aircraft that carries a torpedo, but I don't think in the particular circumstance that you're referring to, i.e. going against surface ships. In that respect, there were quite a few concepts, 1 or 2 prototypes, and a lot of design studies done. But as far as I'm aware, the only country that put jet-powered torpedo bombers into service at any significant number was the Soviet Union. They had a couple of designs, including the IL-28, when you can see here, with them loading a design up. I think this is a rocket-powered torpedo, but, such as it is. And the reason for the relative scarcity of jet-powered torpedo bombers was simply that, one, even with the late World War II and post-World War II advances in how to drop torpedoes, the fact that the Avenger, by the end of the war, could drop a torpedo a lot further out and travelling a lot faster, that still significantly obviated most of the advantages of a jet, which was moving really fast, dropping a torpedo at 500 knots. That's not going to end well for the torpedo, certainly if you're doing a low-level anti-shipping strike operation. And with the advent of radar-guided short-range, medium-range, and even medium to moderately long-range anti-aircraft guns, and the relatively limited range of torpedoes, getting in that close was becoming increasingly more and more suicidal, which meant that the torpedo as an air-dropped weapon against ships was very definitely on its way out. They were looking into longer-range guided options like missiles and so forth instead. Or bombs, because bombs could be dropped whilst the aircraft was travelling a heck of a lot faster than a torpedo could, for the most part. Vokir asks, how long after the First and Second World Wars were errant sea mines a threat to shipping? And what was the last ship to be sunk or heavily damaged by a leftover mine? Those mines remained a threat for a surprisingly long time, actually. During the Korean War, for example, there was quite a bit of extensive Allied demining efforts, not because the North Koreans were laying massive minefields everywhere, but because in the 5 or 6 years between the latter part of World War II and the Korean War, a large number of colonies of mines that had been laid off of Japanese coastlines at the end of World War II had migrated and were now showing up off the Korean coastline, which was not a particularly good idea for the Allied ships who are now operating off the Korean coastline, because you don't really want to be sunk by your own mines from the previous war. And through the 1950s, several warships were actually damaged or sunk by errant mines, either from the other side or their own side, while they were trying to clear them, both in the Pacific and in the Mediterranean. And errant mines from both world wars still are floating around, washing up on beaches, fetching up in fishing nets, occasionally being retrieved from wind turbine fields offshore, where they're bobbing around potentially about to do a lot of damage. And they still remain lethal in a large number of cases. For example, technically speaking, depending on who you believe, because, referencing the last but one answer, this is an ongoing conflict issue, but according to at least some sources, last year, so 2023, a Turkish grain vessel was damaged by a ex-World War II mine in the Baltic. Now, of course, whether you choose to believe it was an ex-World War II mine or somebody else's more recently laid mine, everybody's still arguing over that to one degree or another. But if the side that says that's probably just an old World War II mine is correct, then yeah, it's an ongoing problem, especially actually in the Baltic and Black Seas, both of which were heavily mined, especially the Baltic. Cody Phillips asks, I've heard that US ships tend to have more crew than other nations' ships of similar roles and or displacements. Could you give a brief comparison of ships' crew numbers in the interwar-World War II period and why US ships might have more crew? Is it just from having so many anti-aircraft guns? During wartime, the rather explosive growth of mass-manufactured anti-aircraft guns aboard US ships certainly did push their crew numbers up quite a bit, as did their particular choices of anti-aircraft gun, because, if for sake of example, if you were looking at a ship that was equipped with maybe a quad 40mm Bofors and 2 twin Bofors mounts, so that gives you 8 40mm barrels, that might be a typical thing you'd find on a US destroyer, a cruiser. You might even find a mixture of twins and quads on a US battleship. But 3 separate gun mounts with 3 separate gun crews plus loading, etc., etc., is going to have a larger crew than, say, an octuple 40mm pom-pom on a British ship, which is obviously just a single mount. It's the same number of barrels, more barrels per a given mount, but both sides at that point can say, well, we've got 8 40mm barrels, but the British ship is going to need fewer men. But there are other issues as well. Remember, the US was one of the first and one of the earliest navies to adopt high-pressure machinery. High-pressure machinery, for all of its benefits, does also require a larger machinery crew. And therefore, if you were to compare the total number of men in a power plant of, say, a North Carolina or South Dakota class battleship compared to a King George V or a Richelieu, or a Littorio even for that matter, you'll tend to find that there are somewhat more crewmen there. And that was actually one of the bigger issues when it came to what kind of aircraft carrier would Canada operate in the post-war environment. the high-speed, high-pressure power plant of an Essex class, because they were offered one or two Essex class carriers, needed a very high number of engineering crew, whereas the slightly slower and slightly less high-pressure power plant aboard a Colossus-Majestic class light fleet carrier from the UK needed far fewer crew. So that was one of the considerations as to why they went with the ex-British carriers instead of American ones. But you also have somewhat more subtle ones, usually involving, ironically enough, the number of guns. So a lot of US destroyers, in fact, almost all of US destroyers built in the interwar period have 5 main guns. A lot of destroyers in other nations built in that time period have 4. Once you get into the big ones later on, some of them have 6, but there's an awful lot of destroyers that are built with 4 main guns. Of course, if you have 4 main guns, you need 4 main gun crews. If you have 5 main guns, that's an additional gun crew. Similarly, when you look at heavy cruisers, if you have 4 twin turrets, that's 8 gun crews. If you have 3 triple turrets, that's another gun crew you need to add. Or if you're a Pensacola or Northampton, there are 10 gun crews that you need to supply for the main guns. And likewise, on legacy ships, the Royal Navy's mainstay in the interwar period, the Queen Elizabeth's, the R's, even Hood, they're all 8-gun ships. They're all 8 15-inch guns. Of course, Renown and Repulse only have 6. So, again, 8 gun crews, or 6 in the case of the Renowns. The vast majority of US battleships in the interwar period are straight-up standard class with 12 14-inch guns. Obviously, you've got the Nevadas with 10, New York and Texas with 10, Arkansas's back to 12, though, and the Colorados with 8. But by percentage, most US battleships in the interwar period have 12 guns for their main battery. That means 12 main gun crews, as opposed to 8 for the British. There are a few other soft factors around exactly the caliber of gun, mess allocations, stewards, cooks, washers, and so on and so forth. But broadly speaking, the aforementioned factors largely account for why the average US ship of the interwar and early World War II period, before the massive growth of anti-aircraft firepower, would tend to have slightly more crew aboard than perhaps would be average across the board elsewhere. Mikko Leitinen asks, how was the division of the bombardment force of Operation Neptune decided, given that some beaches had multiple battleships and at others the heaviest asset was a light cruiser? The initial layout was pretty much decided by what was the most immediate threat to the landings. That is distinct from the ongoing operation because, as we know, various battleships would show up off of pretty much every, if not all, beaches to engage various targets at various points during the overall Operation Neptune, Operation Overlord landings and subsequent operations. But for June 6th, 1944, it was a question of what is there that can directly threaten either the landings themselves, the men going onto the beaches, or the ships that are delivering them. Because if it's more general, pillboxes, that kind of stuff that's going to threaten the actual men, well, a cruiser or a destroyer can deal with that because you're still talking about 4.5, 4.75, 6-inch guns. That's still, medium to heavy artillery from a land-based perspective, and lots of it. So that's more than enough to suppress and the defences and assist the men. But when you're talking about bigger guns, 8-inch, 9.4-inch, 11, 12, 15, whatever inch, the really big stuff, the stuff that could actually hit and destroy landing craft, LSTs, supply ships, or even threaten the lighter warships in the vicinity, then those batteries needed to be engaged by much bigger, nastier, meaner ships, hence the battleships being deployed to those places. Of course, once the landings had initially succeeded, those batteries were, top of the list of places to be seized, and that's why the battleships got relocated and in some cases reinforced because more battleships were brought in to engage other further away batteries or heavy troop concentrations as time went on. Jim Smitty asks, why did US Navy aircrew start wearing brown shoes instead of the standard black shoes? A number of fairly authoritative sources seem to indicate that at the start of US naval aviation, they were issued with the same black dress shoes as everybody else, but because obviously naval aviation at that point didn't have any aircraft carriers, and even when they did, flight training started out, and when the carrier was in port, flight operations were run from land-based airfields. They very quickly discovered that, brown-beige dust from the airfield was near constantly messing up their black shoes and boots, and this was very irritating. And so some of the earliest pilots of US naval aviation decided, stuff this, we're going off to a nearby cobbler's, and they got themselves some nice brown shoes made, which somewhat more disguised the dust. And since that represented a significant percentage of total American naval aviation assets at that point in terms of pilots, people kind of went, oh, that seems like a practical-ish solution. We'll run with that. And then it eventually became standard practice. And finally for this week, Joao Rita asks, do we know if the Italian Navy ever considered a naval bombardment of Valleta, that's in Malta, specifically the area of the port? A couple of battleships with escorts, maybe time it to have air cover from Sicily. The Italians certainly looked into a variety of options for attacking Valleta. Obviously, they went primarily with air attacks. They did also try to attack Malta using 10th Flotilla, their specialist underwater and small-scale surface combatant division. But the idea of going after Valleta with heavy firepower battleships or heavy cruisers essentially ran into the problem of the Italians had a fairly decent estimation of what would likely happen in that scenario. They knew that Valleta was the home base for a number of submarines and destroyers, obviously all armed with torpedoes. There was a struggling contingent of aircraft, and as time went on later on, obviously with when you get into the real period of Force K, there were also torpedo bombers and so forth based in Malta. And, of course, you had the Mediterranean Fleet and Force H, which had a disturbing tendency of showing up when they were least wanted. And it would be fairly easy to spot, given the amount of air recon that was going on, a major fleet incursion heading down that way. And so what the Italians were worried about was that if they did sail capital ships, for example, into close enough range to bombard Valleta, there was a good chance they might run into minefields, and if they didn't run into minefields, they would probably run into submarines and destroyers, and if they somehow managed to evade the minefields and the submarines and the destroyers, there was a decent chance they'd be attacked by torpedo bombers, and if they managed to evade being hit by minefields, submarines, destroyers and torpedo bombers, there was also a pretty good chance that the Mediterranean fleet might show up at their backs and attack them either with carrier-based aircraft or surface gunnery or both. And, of course, any ship that was damaged in the vicinity of Malta would have to be abandoned, because standing and fighting in that kind of environment would just invite further losses. So the risk-reward ratio just wasn't worth it. And that brings us to an end for this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. And we're closing in on 500,000 subscribers almost as quickly as we're closing in on Drydock episode 300. So let's see how everything pans out over the next couple of weeks, shall we? Thanks for listening, and see you again in another video.